Is often referred to as a story of the widow's mite, which was a term I probably during King James's time for the little bit of money. Many see this story as about generosity, as a model for stewardship. If it hadn't been Stewardship Sunday last Sunday, this Sunday would probably be used as a stewardship text. It often is. And that feels right if you just read the last 4 verses. But if we read the whole thing, and the lectionary people decided that this was a pericope we should be looking at, we realize that Jesus is contrasting the temple Pharisees. And the temple Pharisees were the creme de la creme of the Pharisees, with this poor widow, and he's angry. The temple Pharisees wear beautiful robes and stoles. I'd have Will model, but he refused. They pace around before all of the less holy and say long and loud pious prayers. And well-to-do people give them lavish gifts, believing they are pleasing God. Jesus is sitting there watching this, and he's angry. He knows God, and he knows that no special vestments or stately buildings are needed to bring you closer to God. Beyond the Pharisees' dress and prayers, the lavish and mysterious temple, Jesus is angry, knowing that all this is supported on an ongoing basis by small contributions from those with scant means. Widows particularly, he speaks of, because once you're widowed, and we're widowed in that society, of course, a man would take over all your assets and theoretically manage them for you for a fee. And that fee, of course, varied. So Jesus sits there watching the Pharisees and seeing rich people ostentatiously put large sums of money in the temple offering. And he sees the Pharisees in their robes and hears their prayers. And then he sees the ragged clothes of the widow and her dropping her last 2 pennies into the offering. And he gathers his disciples together and says, "Look, she has given all that she has to live on in the midst of this finery." And he's angry. Many stewardship sermons have taken Jesus' statement to be one of admiration, that this woman has given all that she has. That's the conventional wisdom on this text. But if we read it carefully, we can see the connection between the splendor of the Pharisees and the destitution of the widow. And it's not a recommendation, but a condemnation that Jesus states. Look what she is doing, Jesus says. She is giving all she has to live on for this frippery and stately building to continue. The poor, those who sit in the very back of the temple, if they're even allowed in at all, were the ones who gave regularly, whose 2 pennies are proportionately so much more than the gifts of the rich. Is this what God desires? This, Jesus knows, is not right. Those in power are living off the accumulation of many small contributions from people for whom it is a real sacrifice. The small contributors have no real idea how their money is used. It was like that then, and it's like that now. I've been going back and forth about including Veterans Day in the sermon First, because I was sure that Dick would do a better job. But I can't seem to stop myself. So I might repeat something that Dick said. And what I really want to talk about is Armistice Day, which, as Dick said, was on November 11th in 1918, and it's November 11th today, 2018, and at 11 a.m., it will be a 100-year anniversary of the cessation of hostilities at the end of the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, the Great War. And they laid down their arms and they celebrated the armistice because that was the war to end all wars. No more wars. The Great War began, I don't know, we were taught something in school. I just want to see how many people were taught the same thing. Do you all know why the First World War started? So there was something that happened in Sarajevo. Some guy, do we know the guy's name? Yeah, that was like the Emperor Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated. That's all I ever learned. No? That's all I ever learned about the First World War, at least in grade school, in middle school. But that was like, they were shot by a minor anarchist and when they were traveling around town in an open coach. And the fighting didn't begin immediately. Again, clothing was important. The Kaiser loved uniforms and spent a lot of time designing what his army would wear. He loved pageantry, and the British loved pageantry as well. But they also loved hierarchy, and they were assigning men from the upper classes to be the officers in this, over privates and corporals. And I forgot that Penny and Malcolm were going to be here, but many of those officers turned out to be incompetent and cost the lives of a lot of men. The royal houses of most of Europe were drawn into the war through these alliances, often involving cousins, siblings, grandchildren. Most all of European royalty were related, mostly through Queen Victoria. And there was a lot of strutting around in uniforms and pronouncements, not unlike the robes and prayers of the Pharisee. The widow who gave all she could to support the temple was not unlike the young men eager to join up and fight for king and country. Having been told by their betters of the justness of the cause, temple or battlefield, they each responded with remarkable loyalty and trust. As Jesus grew angry watching the widow give her last few coins, we can imagine him at the prayers and blessings that launch teenagers into battle. It wasn't that long ago that I heard words between nuclear powers which sounded like a game of chicken, and I wondered if we would be the next helpless victims. I struggled today as to whether to address this or not, because today is Veterans Day, and I realized that I have Veterans Day confused with War Day. This is about veterans, and working toward and wanting peace is not unpatriotic. Wanting peace is not unpatriotic. Somehow I felt that it was. But we are here in this temple, and maybe Jesus would be angry at our trappings and ecclesiastical stuff, but it is my fervent belief that Jesus does not want war, that we are here to learn to talk without rancor and to listen without judgment. We give thanks for those who fought so that we can have our way of life. But the most authentic thing we can do in remembrance, to honor those names that are listed at the back of the room on that hanging, those who died in the Second World War, the most authentic way we can honor them is to do everything to stop it happening again. But peace is so much harder than war. Understanding and compromising is an inch-by-inch campaign. It is easier to plan and produce and plot a great event. I'm not saying that war is easy, that the sacrifices of war are negligible, that we have not fought for some honorable causes. War is complicated and costly, but when I say war is easier than peace, I refer to the simplicity of deciding to annihilate an enemy, the labeling of another culture or country as an enemy. When someone is an enemy, we don't need to question. The thing to do is to destroy them. And destruction is so much easier than construction, both in tangible terms and in relationships. It is easier to write a friend off than to try to work out our differences. I know, I hear you're thinking peace with ISIS, with those who only want to destroy or convert us. How naive she is. I hear that voice. Well, maybe it's my own voice. But when I think about the resources that go into war, what would it be like if we put that energy into peace? All the European participants in the Great War knew it was coming for about 4 years and spent lots of time arming and planning, only to end up, at least in the European war, like a wind-up toy against a wall and move only inch by inch. I'm hearing your voices again telling me, why are you telling us this? We're just people in Winchester, little people, maybe good people, maybe very competent people. But we are at the mercy of our leaders and egos that we cannot affect. But that is the only way that peace becomes a priority. If people sitting in pews and kneeling on carpets in faith make it so, maybe we've just made a step in that direction with a new generation and a new demographic in our government. In the end, it is always the people and their God. It is never the bombs and the fighter jets. It is the people who launch them. It is always the people and our God. It is never the magnificence of the building or the elegance of the vestments. It is the widow who can build one penny at a time. It is the neighbor listening to stories of a refugee journey or sharing a traditional meal. Peace is hard, but the equipment is inexpensive, and we are already at work, sitting vigil with Shir Tikva, walking outside detention centers, praying together, housing a refugee in transition. 100 years ago, almost precisely, when you hear our bell rung 11 times at 11 o'clock, it will be precisely 100 years ago that we lay down our arms thinking we would never have to pick them up again. And yet we've spent a good deal of that time arming. Can you imagine? Can you even conceive of if we had put that time, those resources, that energy into peace, what the world might look like now, I can't either. But let's not be in the same place 100 years from now. We can do it. God is stronger than hate. Love is stronger than war. Peace is real and possible. Amen.